Hello, my name's Rachel Geddes and I'm the autism practitioner for the Child Health and Disability Service, and I'm also the coordinator for the neurodevelopmental training team which runs from the Pines in Inverness. Today we're going to talk about some individual work that I've been doing with a lot of children just lately that we found incredibly beneficial for helping staff that are working with that child to understand their autism. People have a lot of preconceptions that autism is one thing and that all autistic people are alike, and that's not true at all. Autism is a spectrum condition, and for each individual their autism presents in a different way, and what they need to support them is different for each individual. So what we're going to do today is just have a talk through the sorts of profiles that I've been working on. If I'm working with a small child, then I'll work directly with their parents. If I'm working with an older child, perhaps sort of 10 up, depending on their level of ability, then I will work on this document with the child directly. It's very empowering for the child to be able to get down on paper what their autism looks like and how they feel about things and what they need putting in place. And it's been really quite powerful to help staff to deal with that individual child's needs on a daily basis. So what we start by doing is thinking about what are the 4 facets of an autism diagnosis. So to have autism, you are diagnosed under 4 different categories. Those are communication, social interaction, flexibility and routine, and sensory processing. So what I then sit down with children and do is think about what are their strengths and their struggles within each individual category. What I will do along with this film is to make sure that on the Pines website you have an example of this grid and you have lots of examples of the sorts of issues and problems that your child may have. You will then be able to start to put together a profile for your own child. So today I'll just talk you through some examples, but don't worry about getting a pen out and scribbling down a quick note. I will make sure that these resources are there in conjunction with the film. So if we start by thinking about communication. Communication is a massive issue for people with autism, but they have strengths and struggles that are different to somebody else with autism. So what we need to think about is for each individual child, what are their strengths within communication? So you might have a child who is able to talk, so that would go down as being a strength. You might have a child who is non-verbal, but actually they've got a really good use of Makaton or of Pod, so that would go down as a strength. So all of the time we're starting to think about not just what the struggles are. We don't want to focus on the negatives. We start by focusing on the positives and thinking about what is this child really good at. We then start to think about what are the particular struggles for that child within communication. So the sorts of examples we might think about are that some people who are autistic don't speak. They're what is called non-verbal. That can happen when a child has a learning disability as well as autism, but it can also happen to a very intellectually able person on the autistic spectrum, that they're just not able to form and articulate words. That does not mean that they can't communicate. They can communicate, but it will be different. So all of the time we're starting to think about what the strengths are, what the struggles are. So it's about having available language, it's about being able to verbalise, it's about having use of a good vocabulary. How good is that person's vocabulary? Often we find that people use a lot of words that they don't actually understand. So it's thinking about, do they articulate more that if you then use the same sort of language back to them, that they wouldn't actually be able to process it. So it's thinking about what we need to do in conjunction with that child's needs. So we think about their understanding of language. We think about whether they're able to start and stop a conversation. So that could be a strength or it could be a struggle for that particular child. We think about whether they're able to understand questions or whether questions need to be broken down and much more simplified. For instance, if I ask you, what would you like to drink? It's a very wide question and it depends on the social context. That's incredibly tricky for somebody who's autistic. I would know that if you offer me a drink and I'm at work, we're probably talking tea or coffee. But I also know that if you offer me a drink and I'm in a pub, then my choices are endless, but it's probably going to be something alcoholic, okay? That's really tricky when you have autism, to know what is available. So breaking down questions into things that are much more simple can make life a lot easier. So questions, that might be a strength for them. They might be able to understand questions really well, but it might be a struggle for your child. Okay? People being clear with instructions. So sometimes we all as adults have a propensity to say, can't you run upstairs, get your school bag, get your trainers, make sure your PE kit's in your bag, come downstairs and get your shoes on. Incredibly complicated. If you have autism, then actually your ability to be able to hold of all of that information in your head could be limited. So we need to think about how a child might need that breaking down. So it might be, nip upstairs and get your school bag. Once he's back downstairs with his school bag, have you got your maths book? Once that's been achieved, right, get your shoes on. Okay, so clear instructions is really important. What we also need to consider is that research suggests that only 7% of the communication that we receive on a daily basis is actually the verbal spoken word. And the rest of communication is made up of facial expressions, tone of voice, gestures, and body language. All of those things are incredibly hard for somebody who is autistic. Okay, so we need to think about the messages that we are giving. Are we giving the correct message? Does your child struggle with some of those messages because your body language is saying something different to what you're actually saying? For instance, I worked with a young man a couple of years ago who, to him, all shouting means you're angry. He lives in a third-floor house. Mum stands at the bottom of the stairs and shouts him to tell him that his tea's ready. Because Mum shouted it, he automatically thinks that he's in trouble. So therefore the communication has broken down. So it's thinking about different ways and then thinking about what strategies can we use to make life easier for that child. So for that particular boy, Mum then started sending him a text message to say that his tea was ready. She didn't need to shout. He then knew she wasn't angry and he was able to come down and eat his meal without feeling anxious because Mum was angry with him. Okay? We need to think about how literal we are with language. Because when we say things, children particularly, but also some adults, take things incredibly literally. So if I say that something's going to happen, they are determined that that thing is going to happen. We also need to be incredibly careful with things like sarcasm or with things like idioms. Because if I say something like, it's raining cats and dogs, I have known a child to look outside and see where the cats and dogs are. It's also things like, keep your eye on the ball. I've known a child pick up a ball and put it on his eye because that is how literal that child was. So it's thinking about your individual child. Your child might not have huge issues within communication. They might have extremely good communication and just a couple of struggles. But for each child, it's going to be different. Then what we start to consider is what are their strengths, what they're really good at, and what are their struggles. And how can I put in a strategy that makes life easier for that child? So the incidents I've just mentioned with shouting upstairs. I also worked with another boy a few years ago whose ability to read and understand written language was far higher than his ability to understand spoken language. So therefore, when I needed him to understand something really clearly, I had to write it down for him. So that became a strategy that all of the staff working around that child used, particularly in school. There'd been issues with that child not following the rules within a classroom, but actually, because the rules had been given verbally, he didn't understand them. Once we gave them in a written format, he did understand them and could comply with them. So a lot of the time, it's really simple things that we can change to help people to be able to cope better. The second facet of an autism diagnosis is social interaction. So within social interaction, we're thinking about a person's capacity to cope within a social situation. So that could be a classroom, it could be a playground, it could be a sports club, or just within your family home or at granny's home or whatever that might be. What are the rules? So for those of us who are not autistic, we understand that the rules change, differing on the places that we are. So if we take the context that I used earlier about drinks, I know within a workplace what I can do, what I can say, how I need to behave. That will differ from how I would behave within a social setting on a Saturday afternoon once I've had a couple of cocktails. And I understand what I can do and what I can't do. That can be incredibly tricky for somebody who is autistic, because understanding that change of perception and that change of rule is incredibly tricky. So if we think about social rules, it's being able to see the hidden meaning behind what people say. Sometimes we have to do a lot of reading between the lines as to what people actually mean. Now, for those of us who are not autistic, that's quite easy, particularly if we know that person really well. If we don't know that person really well, it might become more complicated. But for somebody who's autistic, that is incredibly difficult. So things like they often misunderstand what the rules are, and they often, or some children, I say not all children, social interaction might be a strength for your child, but it might be a struggle. Some of the struggles they might have is not understanding the rules within classrooms, within PE lessons, in the playground. So for example, I was talking to a 14-year-old boy yesterday, and one of the struggles he's having is that he loves to play football. So when he plays football, he plays for a team, and the team has rules. When he plays out with his mates on a Saturday afternoon on the local field, those rules don't apply. But because he has social interaction issues, he finds that incredibly difficult, because actually a rule is a rule and we should be following the rule. So then he gets quite upset and agitated, the other boys don't understand why, and then there becomes a breakdown in his social interaction. And that's really difficult for him. So it's thinking about how we then behave socially. Eye contact is something that comes up a lot when we think about the autistic spectrum. As neurotypical people, we see eye contact as being something that's normal and natural. For somebody with autism, that could be incredibly difficult and incredibly painful. So it's thinking about, do we really need that to happen? Or can we teach them, can we give them a strategy where they look like they're giving you eye contact, but really they're not? Yeah, so it's like a social conforming type thing. But actually you can look like you're giving somebody eye contact by staring in the middle of the head. Okay, and I've worked with lots of teenagers who use that as a strategy. It's thinking about other people's different interests. So for instance, if you have a child who's absolutely passionate about their certain subject, let's say for instance dinosaurs, tends to be quite a common one. So they want to talk and talk and talk about their dinosaurs. That's a means of social interaction for them, but it's really difficult for them to know when to stop, when to start, when to let somebody else speak. They might have some anxiety around social interaction and could be isolating themselves, not wanting to go out. But actually, we have a preconceived idea that people should want to socially interact because that's how we feel. I had a fantastic conversation with a young man that I know a few years ago because he spends a lot of time on his PlayStation. And he's particularly good at certain games and he's top of, certain leagues and things like that. And that is his social interaction. He's talking to people all over the world. But he really struggles with face-to-face interaction. And I was trying to encourage him to join a group to play games with, actually all sat in the same room. And he said to me, Rachel, why on earth would I want to do that? I talk to people all over the world. Why would I want to sit in a room in Inverness and talk to people about that? I was like, yeah, actually, you've probably got a point, because what I see as social interaction and what he sees as social interaction are two very different things, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that his social interaction or mine are any better or any worse than the other person's. It's all about our personal perspective and actually what is meaningful to me. So again, we're looking for strengths within that category, struggles within that category, and what can I do to help? The main thing that we probably do to help within the social interaction category is use things like social stories, because the social story helps a child to understand that there is a different rule within this context, and to help them to figure out what they can do and what they can't do in a written format, using pictures a lot of the time of what is appropriate and what's not. Those of us that are neurotypical can go into a social situation and can figure out what we need to do by watching the other people around us. And that starts from sort of a nursery level upwards, that we would start to see what I can get away with and what I can't get away with. And we'll all know that young children push their boundaries to see what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. For children on the autistic spectrum, that doesn't come as naturally. So a lot of the time, we're having to teach that social behaviour via the use of a social story or a comic strip conversation, depending on the age of that child. If you want to learn more about social stories, there is another video as part of this series where you can learn how to write a social story. And then if we move on to flexibility and routine, now this one can be a little bit tricky to get your head round. So what we talk a lot about nowadays is something called theory of mind, central coherence and flexibility of thought, okay? In a nutshell, what this means is, as a neurotypical adult, I can try to put myself in the position of somebody else. I can get the gist of a story. I can walk into a room and figure out what's happening. I can, or I know that somebody else's thoughts and feelings are different to mine. That is really, really difficult for somebody on the autistic spectrum. They don't have as much capacity to do that instinctively as we do who are neurotypical. They can learn it, we can teach them, we can support them, okay? But that's going to take a lot of time and a lot of patience. So what we're thinking about in flexibility of routine is thinking about change. So change is massive for somebody on the autistic spectrum. We sometimes call it a transition, depending on what it is, but any change is quite tricky. So if you're expecting something to happen and then it doesn't happen and you don't know the reason why it's not happened, that can be quite anxiety provoking. It can also be quite anxiety provoking if you were expecting to, say, go straight from home to Wynn Park, but on the way your mum decides to stop off at Tesco's to get a pint of milk. That is a change and a transition that you weren't expecting. So therefore, that raises the anxiety levels of children quite often, which then leads to sometimes to some challenging behaviour. So it's thinking about all of the time, what change can a child cope with, what transitions are going to be difficult, and how much detail comes into those. Because there can be a massive amount of detail in one transition or change. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an example. I have 12-year-old twins who've moved up to the academy this year. If you think about the change that they've gone through, it's actually more immense than you're first considering. So our village school is literally at the end of the road that we live on. So all of their school history, they've just walked to school, either with me or when they were older on their own. Now they have to be out an hour earlier than what they were currently out. So that's one change. They have to get on a school bus, 2 changes. They're on a school bus with lots of kids that are a lot older than them, and apparently the volume level is pretty intense, and the language that is used on that bus is pretty awful at times, apparently. Okay, we've got another change. That bus is then driving across the Black Isle to their secondary school. So they're on that bus for approximately 30 minutes. There's going to be huge changes within that period. They're then getting off the bus and going into a busy secondary school. 5 changes. I missed one before we even started. Their uniform is different. So they're now wearing a shirt and tie as opposed to a polo shirt and a hoodie. Okay? 6 changes. They're now moving from class to class. 7 changes. They've got a different teacher for every session. 8 changes. They have to go to the dinner hall to eat their meal. They have to choose their meal and pay for their meal. Yeah? Choosing, number 9. Paying, number 10. And that goes on and on all day. So if you can imagine that your child is on the autistic spectrum, when we're thinking about a change or a transition, sometimes we think about it being too simple. And actually, when you get into the nitty-gritty of it, there are huge amounts of changes that happen on a daily basis that your child has to cope with. So we think about the strengths. Are they able to cope with that? Is that a struggle? Think about what strategies does that child need? What will they need to be able to survive in that environment? Could be a colour-coded timetable. It could be a buddy. It could be a friend helping them at lunchtime. Okay? Because all of those transitions are incredibly difficult. A lot of people with autism, but not all, like routine, like structure, and like things to be in a set way. However, there are some kids that we would describe as being demand avoidant, that if we are constantly thinking about everything being structured, everything being routine, everything being the same, that then creates a demand, which creates huge anxiety. So for that child, those strategies would be different. Okay, and so again, it's thinking about an individual child. Where are the strengths? Where are the struggles? What can we do to put a strategy in to support that child? The final thing that comes into an autistic spectrum diagnosis is sensory processing. So this is quite recent to the diagnosis. It changed with the diagnostic criteria probably about 3 or 4 years ago. We always knew that people with autism had sensory processing difficulties, but now it is part of the criteria for diagnosis. So in this one, we're not thinking about strengths, struggles and well, we will think about strategies. So then we need to identify for your individual child, what are their issues around sensory processing and what are the strategies that we can do to help them. So for instance, the first one that we're thinking about is sight. Can your child, for instance, cope with bright light? If you think of places like a supermarket, where it's very intense overhead lighting, is your child going to be able to cope with that? Possibly not. What sort of strategies could we use? Well, it's quite all right nowadays to walk around with a baseball cap on your head, yeah, which then shields you from some of the light, or a pair of sunglasses. You might have a child who in the summer really struggles with bright light. Yeah, it's okay to wear some sunglasses. It's okay that in certain classes we say, do you know what, that child cannot sit at that desk at 2 o'clock in the afternoon because actually the sun will come straight in and hit them. And that can be really quite disturbing for some children. Smell is another of the senses that can be quite disturbing for a child on the autistic spectrum, or could be something that they really like. I work with a wee boy who's 9. He absolutely loves smell. He loves different smell. He loves to investigate smell. For that child, it's helping them to do that appropriately, because if you've got some new perfume on or something, he will give you a good sniff. Yeah, and will occasionally lick you, which is probably pushing it a little bit far. So the strategy for him has been around social stories to explain to him that it's okay to like people's smell and to maybe have a little smell of people that find that acceptable, people you know really well, but actually it's not okay to lick people. The next one is hearing. People can be quite sensitive to things that are quite loud, quite noisy, quite unpredictable. If we're thinking about senses, we also need to consider whether that child is hypersensitive to it. So that means that they feel things very strongly, or they're hyposensitive to it, which means that they don't register it as well as they should. That can differ from day to day. So with hearing, we often find children that don't like unpredictable loud noise. So if you think about fire alarms, the school bells, hand dryers in toilets are a massive issue. It could be unpredictable music coming on. I know one boy who absolutely cannot cope with the radio on in the car. Alternatively, I know another boy who needs the radio on in the car because one's hyper and one's hypo. So it differs from child to child. You will know what your child needs and what they cope with and what they don't cope with. Putting a profile together for your child is incredibly empowering, because then that can be passed to every member of staff that works with them, and they're going to get a much better understanding of what makes your child tick, rather than just think autism, they're not going to like bright lights or hearing, when actually they might. Yeah, it differs from person to person. The next one is taste. Some children like very strong tastes, and some people don't like really strong tastes. And that can be quite extreme for some kids, where they've got quite a limited diet because they're not able to cope with some tastes that are stronger or more sour or more sweet. It becomes overwhelming. Your next one is touch. So when we think about touch, a lot of us don't mind being touched, but some of us really dislike being touched. So I will hug everybody that I meet, whereas my sister absolutely hates hugs. We're both neurotypical, yeah, so it differs anyway. But actually for somebody on the autistic spectrum, touch can be quite intrusive. On the opposite side of that, you might have a child who touches everything and everybody, and sometimes that can become quite intrusive. So again, the use of social stories can really help that child to manage that behaviour better. Or it might be that your child just needs lots and lots of what we call deep pressure. So lots of hugs, lots of cuddles, lots of exercises that's using their muscles and joints, because that helps them to feel much calmer. Differs from person to person. We've also got balance as the next one. Balance can be quite tricky for some people who are autistic. So riding a bike can be quite difficult. Being on a balance beam in a PE lesson can be quite tricky. Perhaps, you know, skateboarding or ice skating are possibly not going to be options for a child who's got difficulties with their balance. The last one on the sensory processing profile is really quite interesting. So it's about having body awareness. Does your child have an awareness of their body in space? Because some people don't, and when you don't, it creates great anxiety. So if you can imagine, as you're sat there now watching this film, what can you feel in your body? So I can feel that my feet are on the floor, and I know that they're at slightly different angles. I can feel that I've got a piece of paper in one hand and then I've not got it in the other hand. And I don't need to look at them to be able to tell that. I can feel the glasses on the end of my nose, and I can feel that they've slipped down slightly, because today my proprioception is good. If my proprioception is not good, then you start to feel those things in a much milder fashion. If your proprioception is really bad, you're not feeling those things at all. So have you got a child who is constantly fidgeting, rocking, tapping, twiddling, and generally throwing themselves around the place? Because that could mean that their proprioception is poor and that they need to be constantly moving in order to be able to feel themselves. That can lead to great anxiety. If your proprioception's poor, it's like being a bottle of pop that's been shook the entire day. You've got this internal agitation going on. The other thing that's also linked to that is what we call interoception. And interoception is about your body's ability to feel what's going on inside. Okay, so I would know when I'm thirsty. I would know when I'm hungry. I know when I need to go to the loo. I know when I've got a backache. If you've got poor interoception, you're not feeling any of those things. So for some children, it's quite difficult to toilet train. Some children will eat excessively because they're not having the sensation of being full. Some children are not conscious of being hungry or thirsty at all, so are therefore reluctant to eat. What I would say is that if you can improve the proprioception, their interoception will also improve. If you need more information about that one, again, there is another video as part of this series that is about sensory processing difficulties. And that goes into great depth about what you can do in order to support your child with sensory processing difficulties. So to put together a profile for your child, if your child's very young, you're perhaps going to have to do it for them, but you can ask them what they like, what they don't like, what they find difficult. If your child is able to, then involve them in the process because it's really empowering. I worked with one child who did his profile as like a funny cartoon, and we used lots of examples in it that made the teacher smile, but it made them remember what his issues and problems were and what they needed to do about it, because he'd put it into such a way that it was really interactive. But having something that explains to people who you are, what your needs are, but also what your strengths are, because autistic kids are incredible at some stuff, and a lot of the time people miss that and they just focus on the struggles. We need to focus on the strengths as well, because the strengths will help us to work out what the strategies are, because you can use a strength to underpin a struggle and to make life easier. All of the documentation that you will need will be in an attachment along with the video on the Pines website. Thank you for listening.